Alchemy is frequently dismissed as a primitive precursor to chemistry, yet in the hands of philosopher and translator Joe Bandel, it becomes a rigorous blueprint for modern psychological transformation. This evolution is central to Chapter 21 of his work, The OAK Matrix Unleashed, where he posits that the trial by fire isn't a historical relic of the laboratory, but a mandatory crucible for anyone seeking genuine alchemical growth. When we avoid difficulty, we aren't just staying safe, we're essentially choosing to remain in a state of lead, heavy, reactive, and static. Bandel argues that real mastery requires us to intentionally embrace the harder path, a concept he links to our innate drive to conquer life's challenges rather than merely surviving them.
It's a provocative stance because it reframes discomfort as a generative force. In Chapter 21, Bandel explains that we're all born with specific goals, those deep, driving passions for creation or impact. But these goals are naturally paired with physical and mental barriers. He uses the metaphor of the oak tree, which is central to his entire OAK matrix system. An oak doesn't become resilient by growing in a greenhouse. It thickens its bark and deepens its roots specifically because it's hammered by harsh winds. In the same way, taking a risk is the fire that alchemizes our base fears into what he calls gold, wisdom, and self-mastery. It's not suffering for the sake of it, but recognizing that growth requires a certain level of intensity that the safe route simply can't provide.
But isn't there a danger in that no pain, no gain mindset? It sounds almost like an invitation to burnout. We see people pushing themselves until they break, physically and mentally, all in the name of growth. Bandel seems to be walking a very thin line between self-improvement and self-destruction. If the trial by fire is too intense, you don't end up as gold, you just end up as ash. How does he account for the human limit, or is he suggesting that those limits are just another barrier to be ignored?
He actually addresses that head-on by redefining duality. Usually we think of the physical and the spiritual as being at war. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak trope. But Bandel introduces the concept of duality as a loving embrace. He suggests that the physical body, with all its limitations and need for effort, is the perfect partner for the spiritual essence. Think of it like a battery. The physical world is the casing that contains the energy, while the spiritual is the charge. If you only focus on spiritual highs, like meditating all day without taking physical action, you become, as the saying goes, so heavenly bound you're no earthly good. The risk-taking he advocates is the point where these two meet. You use the spiritual insight to choose a path, but you use the physical effort to walk it. The fire is controlled. It's a tool for refinement, not a wildfire meant to consume you.
That leads us to one of the most interesting technical parts of his theory, the psyche web. He describes the mind not as a flat surface, but as a complex network of memories, beliefs, and past experiences. If I'm understanding him correctly, this web effectively becomes our program. It dictates how we move from point A to point B. But if we only ever take the safe paths, we're just reinforcing the same old threads in that web. We're essentially trapped in a mental rut of our own making. So is risk-taking essentially a way to force the brain to build new connections?
Exactly. Bandel views the psyche web as a literal structure that governs our reality. If there's no link in your web between current situation and success, you can't just wish your way there. You need a shock to the system to forge a new association. Safe paths are like paved roads. They're easy, but they only take you where you've already been. Taking a risk, doing something that scares you or challenges your status quo, is like cutting a new trail through the woods. It's harder, yes, but it expands the map of what you're capable of. This is why he says spiritual strength alone isn't enough to overcome barriers. You can visualize success all you want, but without that physical shock of action, the psyche web doesn't rewire itself. The risk is the catalyst that creates the jump from old thinking to a quantum leap in perspective.
It's a very active form of psychology. It reminds me of the shock absorber method he discusses elsewhere, where intensity is treated as a nutrient rather than a threat. But let's get into the specifics of these born goals he mentions. He says we have an innate drive for things like love or creation, yet we often prioritize spiritual highs over bodily realities. I've noticed this in a lot of modern wellness culture, this idea that if you just manifest hard enough, the physical world will bend. Bandel seems to be saying the opposite, that the physical world is where the real work happens.
He's very critical of that imbalance. He argues that denying the body, whether through neglecting health, finances, or practical responsibilities, actually creates a rut where spiritual energy stagnates. If you have a goal to be a great artist, but you're afraid of the physical risk of rejection, your spiritual dream has no vessel. In the OAK matrix, the physical provides the containing force, the structure, while the spiritual provides the generative force. When you take a calculated risk, like finally submitting your work or starting that difficult conversation, you're allowing those two forces to embrace. The tension of the risk is what merges them. It's like the bark of the oak tree again. It's the physical barrier that protects the inner life of the tree while it grows. You need both to survive the storm.
So how do we actually apply this without jumping off a metaphorical cliff? Bandel isn't suggesting we take reckless risks, right? He uses the term calculated, but in a world that's increasingly obsessed with safety and cancel culture and social security, even a small risk can feel like a life or death situation. What are the practical steps for someone who feels stuck in their psyche web and wants to start this alchemical process?
He outlines a few very concrete exercises. First is the risk journal. You don't just guess, you list a born goal and the specific barrier blocking it. Then you brainstorm the harder path. For instance, if you're stuck in a career rut because you're afraid of public speaking, the harder path isn't just taking a class, it's signing up for a presentation where the stakes are real. You then reflect on how that physical action, the literal act of standing in front of people, supports your spiritual vision of being a leader. Another one is the web expansion exercise. You identify a repetitive thought, like, I'm not qualified, and you intentionally introduce a radical new experience, or even just a contrary viewpoint, to force a new mental association. It's about creating jumps in the web.
I like the idea of the partner risk share too. It acknowledges that doing this alone is incredibly difficult. He mentions different types of risks for different energies, like expansive goals versus containing boundaries. It seems like he's trying to make risk a habit rather than a one-time heroic act. If you take one small risk daily, you're constantly refining your lead into gold in small increments.
Right. It's a rhythmic process. He even suggests an alchemical ritual where you visualize your barrier as lead and the risk as fire. But the key is that the ritual must be followed by a daily physical act. You can't just do the visualization. This goes back to his core philosophy of organic Gnosticism, the idea that truth isn't found in a book or a church, but in your own direct lived experience. If you haven't experienced the burn of the risk, you haven't really learned the truth of your own strength. By choosing the harder path, you're essentially proving to your own psyche that the governors or limits you thought were there are actually flexible.
It really flips the script on how we view fear. Instead of fear being a signal to stop, it becomes a signal that you're at the edge of your psyche web, that you're at the very point where growth is possible. It's like the oak tree again. The wind isn't trying to knock it down, it's giving the tree the resistance it needs to grow stronger. If we see our challenges as loving partners in our development, the whole experience of life changes. We stop being victims of our circumstances and start being the alchemists of our own destinies.
And that is the ultimate goal of the OAK matrix. It's about empowerment through integration. When we stop running from the fire of life's difficulties and start stepping into it with intention, we emerge as that golden self Bandel talks about, resilient, radiant, and finally free from the ruts of our own past programming. It turns the idea of a hard life into a mastered life. The challenges don't go away, but your relationship to them transforms from one of conflict to one of embrace.
It's a powerful way to look at the daily grind as something far more significant than just survival. If you found this exploration of alchemical growth and the psyche web useful, consider sharing this episode with someone who might be standing at their own crossroads today.